So hello to the Foggy Bottom West End villagers and to the villagers who are joining us from the other villages in the DMV. Today we'll be talking about Dress Codes, book by Richard Thompson Ford, who we're excited to have with us. Richard Thompson Ford is a writer and law professor at Stanford University. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Slate, Esquire, all over the place. And he's written several books. This is his latest, of course. But he's also written The Race Card, How Bluffing About Bias Makes Race Relations Worse, and Rights Gone Wrong. Today we'll be talking about laws of fashion, because being underdressed, overdressed, this is more than a faux pas. It can land you in jail, result in exclusion and denial of employment opportunities. The book starts in the 1300s and covers regulations of amount of fabric that can be used for garments and regulation of things such as crowns, and ends in present times with discussion of things like Mark Zuckerberg's gray T-shirts and everything in between. It explores how social movements inspired sartorial innovation, the laws and workplace rules and social customs relating to fashion, and sartorial transgression, an in-depth analysis of the meaning of fashion. We'll start with a presentation by Rich Ford, move to some questions and answers and some prompts of different articles of clothing, and then open it up to questions from the village. If you do have any questions, we'll cover them towards the end of the presentation, so please enter them into the chat box. Rich?
Hi, thanks Paloma for that introduction, and thanks to the Foggy Bottom Village, West End Village, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about my latest book. I'm a law professor and I teach employment discrimination and civil rights courses. And so one question you might have is, why is someone who works at a law school, who's a lawyer focused on social justice issues for his career, writing a book about fashion? There are two reasons. One's professional and one's personal. The professional reason is that there are a lot of legal disputes, a surprising number of legal disputes that involve dress codes, whether they're workplace dress codes that regulate, for instance, how women should present themselves. In one case, required a woman to wear full makeup and tease her hair, and this woman lost her job because she refused to do that. Some cases regulate hairstyles and prohibit hairstyles, for instance, that are unique to, or at least predominantly worn by African Americans. There are dress codes in high schools. Every year, there's a dispute around prom time that involves a young woman being excluded from her high school prom because of something that she's wearing. And many of these dress codes are quite strict with fairly severe penalties. Students are kicked out of school and sent home, or forced to wear embarrassing clothing. In one case, a young woman who violated a school dress code was required to wear a neon yellow shirt with the words "dress code violator" emblazoned on the front of it as punishment for violating the dress codes. And you might think that in today's environment, where people tend to say that they don't care about what people wear, and we're relaxed and casual, that there'd be fewer dress codes than in the past. But in many ways, the opposite is true. So for instance, in the school context, the number of high schools that report having a strict dress code has increased over the past decade or so. And these dress codes affect millions of people in a variety of areas of life. Now, so there are legal disputes around dress codes, and those legal disputes, as a lawyer, I always felt missed some of the point. They missed some of why people cared so much, why employers and schools cared so much about what people wore, that they'd be willing to, for instance, lose a valued employee or interfere with someone's education in order to enforce a dress code, and also why the people, the employees or the students cared so much that they violated the dress code and could suffer some fairly significant consequences. So I wanted to look into the history of rules and regulations around dress in order to try to understand more what was at stake. So that's the professional reason. The personal reason is, one, I'm a little bit of a clothes horse. I like clothing and I like fashion. And so I had it was personally fun to look into this. And also, I learned from the example of my father, who was the first African American to work in the university where he became an administrator. He was a community organizer and civil rights activist. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he was a successful academic. And his mode of dress, his self-presentation, was something that I understood even as a small child was very important to him. And as I grew older, I started to see that a lot of his relationship to clothing had to do with navigating racial barriers. So there were significant and high stakes involved in how he presented himself. Now, he enjoyed fashion like I did. He was also trained as a tailor at a time when many African Americans in African American colleges learned a trade as well as a profession in case racial barriers kept them from pursuing their chosen profession. So he knew a lot about clothing. He cared about it, he enjoyed it, but it was also important for him for these larger social reasons. And that example made me understand that clothing, self-presentation, what we might describe broadly as fashion, matters. It's not superficial, it's not irrelevant, it's not frivolous in the way that a lot of people imagine. So I wanted to look at the history of rules and social norms and regulations around clothing for those reasons. And as I started to look, I found myself being drawn further and further back in history. So I started in the 21st century and I wound up in the 1300s, trying to get at the roots of the way we think about fashion and the regulation of clothing and self-presentation today. I'm going to try to share the screen now. There we go. Now, the book begins in the 1300s, as I suggested. And at that period of time, we saw an explosion of new regulations around fashion. You had what were called acts of apparel in Tudor England, but also a series of sumptuary laws, laws regulating who could wear what type of clothing throughout Europe. A few things happened in order to prompt this explosion of new laws, and it's really quite striking to see the pattern from a very, very small number of laws regulating clothing to a very large number as you move from the 1300s and that's the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance. A few things have happened. One, tailoring begins to really develop. And because the art of tailoring becomes much more sophisticated at this period of time, where before most clothing for elites was draped, there were robes, there were gowns, and in the ancient world, of course, there were what we now call togas. But as tailoring develops, it allows for the creation of much more expressive clothing. And that clothing was used by elites and people in power in order to express their social position. Queen Elizabeth, for instance, was famous for her elaborate clothing, as was her father, Henry VIII. And that clothing was a type of statecraft. And so rather than just a matter of personal vanity or personal style, this was an important part of the way they exercised power. And it was important to ensure that certain symbols of status were reserved for the elites. Now, I have a picture here of a garment called trunk hose. And one of the disputes that I begin with in the book involves a hapless man named Richard Walwyn, who wore a pair of what were described as monstrous trunk hose. And you'll notice these pants have kind of strips and they're panels where they can be stuffed. And his were apparently so large and so ostentatious that they were considered to be contrary to good order. And he was arrested, marched in front of the magistrate where the linings of his trunk hose were cut, and his garment was then placed in a public place as an example of extreme folly for all to see. In 1551, a royal proclamation lamented that the use of monstrous and outrageous greatness of hosen, crept elate into the realm, to the great slander thereof, and the undoing of a number using the same, being driven for maintenance thereof to seek such unlawful ways as have brought them to destruction. So you began to get a series of laws that were designed to regulate who could wear what type of attire. Now, the official justification for these laws was that the clothing was too expensive. But in reality, what was happening was that you had a new emerging group of non-aristocrats who were making money: bankers, merchants, tradespeople. The economy was booming, something very familiar to what we've seen in recent years today in our society. And as those emergent classes began to get money, they wanted to express themselves through fashion, much in the way the elite did. But now they weren't necessarily trying to copy the elite or to pass themselves off as aristocrats. And instead, they were doing something that was even more dangerous to the power structure. And that's that they were asserting the importance of their own social class. They were saying, I'm a banker, I'm a merchant, I'm important. I deserve this type of expressive clothing just like the aristocrats. And that the power structure couldn't have. And so you started to get a proliferation of laws trying to prevent people from using symbols that had been historically reserved to the elite. This, as I mentioned, this happened all over Europe. Here's an example of the way fashion expressed political status. Queen Elizabeth dressed in this way in order to express her magnificence. It was almost a shock and awe campaign. This was a time in which most people were illiterate, and so the symbols of power couldn't be written down. They had to be experienced, they had to be seen. And so this type of clothing was very important. I'm going to fast forward. There's a lot I'll have to skip about the book because we don't have much time. But I'm going to fast forward several hundred years to the 1700s because this is when things begin to change. For hundreds of years, clothing and status have been linked in a way that status is expressed through magnificence. Silks, brocade, jewels, opulence. These are the symbols of status and power. And this is still true. This is true for men and women, and in some ways for men more than women. One of the striking things I found in my research is that for all this period of time, the most dramatic and cutting edge innovations in fashion were in men's fashion. Women's fashion copied and tended to adopt only certain elements of fashionable innovations made by men, where men wore things like trunk hose and various types of tailored trousers. Women remained draped below the waist until the early 20th century. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But so men are expressing their high status through this type of clothing, the sumptuous clothing, as much as women. Military officers would bring makeup and powder, face powder, onto the field of battle. This was a sign of masculine privilege. And this continued until sometime in the 1700s when things began to change. And a group of men, first starting in England and later spreading, started to reject this type of sumptuous and elaborate clothing in favor of more streamlined clothing, something that'll be familiar to us today. This is the precursor of the three-piece suit. It's a moment that later historians described as the great masculine renunciation, where men renounced opulence and display in favor of sober and streamlined clothing. Now, men didn't really renounce fashion. Instead, the symbols of fashion changed. They became expressed through details like refined fabrics, like cut, like tailoring, internal things that were harder to copy, and things that also expressed a new political ideal. They expressed an ideal of civic virtue in terms of practicality, sobriety, industriousness. These were the values of the Enlightenment, and these Enlightenment values began to be expressed through clothing, but only men's clothing. Women continued to wear the opulent and somewhat cumbersome clothing that had characterized both sexes prior to that. So it's the great masculine renunciation, not the great renunciation generally. But just to give you an example of the way that people cared about this, one time when an English gentleman who had adopted this more streamlined style because it started in England. There's a history behind that we can talk about in questions and answers if you'd like. But beginning in England, traveled to France where the old aristocratic courtly dress was still the norm. And he said something like this. So he had to wear this elaborate clothing that the English had renounced. He said, I felt as much deprived of my liberty as if I had been placed in the Bastille. And I longed for my little frock coat, and that's the more streamlined version, for it places a man under no great restraint, but leaves him free to do as he wishes, much like our glorious Constitution. So right there, he's tied together the symbolism of clothing with political ideals and a political system and political aspirations. That's a dress code that has profound social significance, and it'll continue in history. I mentioned that this was the great masculine renunciation, and for centuries later, women struggled in many cases against their clothing that was cumbersome, clothing that in some sense expressed the old and discredited values of the old regime at a time when social virtue was thought to reside again in industriousness and sobriety and practicality. But women are wearing these elaborate gowns. In some sense, the women are expressing status vicariously for their men, their fathers, their husbands. But several dress reform movements began and failed. Many of you may be familiar, for instance, with the historical figure Amelia Bloomer, who pioneered a new form of women's clothing, the bloomers, they're named after her, which was a kind of women's pants. A fashion craze on both sides of the Atlantic, in the United States and England, took off for about a year or so, and then was ridiculed out of existence. And eventually Amelia Bloomer herself retreated to wearing the crinoline, which was a huge cage hoop skirt, and even expressed that was, well, at least a little better than the heavy layers and layers of petticoats that women used to have to wear. So women were struggling against their attire, and continued to struggle until the early 20th century, when the flappers finally succeeded in making streamlined women's wear fashionable. So the flapper movement, which we often think of as frivolous, Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby, women simply drinking speakeasy cocktails and driving in fast cars. But quite the contrary, flappers were a socioeconomically diverse, racially diverse group of women, often working women, women who were fighting for women's rights, women's suffrage, and were expressing their ambition to enter society on terms equal to men through their clothing. And people understood this very clearly at the time, and they worried about it. And there were dress codes that tried to ban flapper fashions. Businesses throughout the United States and in Europe outlawed various aspects of flapper fashions for a period of time. And political commentary made it very clear the link between women's liberation and these new fashions. I'll give one last example of the social significance of clothing, and this involves the movement for racial justice. For centuries, it was a social offense, and in some cases even a legal offense, for African Americans to dress in refined and elegant clothing. In the United States in 1740, there was a law in South Carolina called the Negro Act, which outlawed Negroes or slaves from dressing above their condition, and authorized anyone who caught them dressing above their condition to seize their clothing and keep it for themselves. So this was taken very seriously. The well-dressed African American was understood to be a threat to white supremacy. And this belief carried on well past the end of the Civil War and emancipation. Many stories recounted racist mobs who would chase down uppity blacks wearing clothing that was thought to be too fancy, too refined, wearing their Sunday best on a day other than Sunday, wearing a military uniform when they weren't actually serving, any longer. All of these things were considered to be a sign of African Americans asserting a status that the society denied to them. So when you get to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and lunch counter sit-ins and public demonstrations, African Americans are wearing their Sunday best. This was more than just an attempt to ingratiate themselves with the power structure. Indeed, quite the opposite. It was a defiant statement. It was an insistence on dignity in the face of white supremacy. And that's something that I think is lost today. In today's environment, very often people look at images like this one and they describe it kind of derisively as the politics of respectability, the notion that somehow this group of people were trying to ingratiate themselves to the power structure. But that's not what's going on here at all. After the civil rights movement, there were many other dress codes. A new generation of civil rights activists did reject the Sunday best attire of this generation, and you got both the kind of workwear that was worn by members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also the kind of more bohemian style of the Black Panthers that was designed to be a distinctive African-American aesthetic, suitable to African-American hair texture. Part of the movement toward Black is Beautiful, which was designed to create a new aesthetic. The Black Panthers had a minister of culture. They cared about this. And in each of these cases, what I want to emphasize is there was something like a dress code. It wasn't an accident that the civil rights protesters marching on Washington all wore their Sunday best. It wasn't an accident that the members of SNCC wore overalls or workwear in solidarity with the working class people they were trying to organize. It wasn't an accident that the Black Panthers wore turtlenecks and sunglasses and leather coats. This was organized because all of these groups understood the importance of the power of fashion and attire. I'll wrap it up there. I have other things to say about the present moment, but I'll leave that for my conversation with Paloma and for our question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. So we've gone through history chronologically, but I thought it would be fun to go through it and discuss different articles of clothing and the relevance to history, the symbolism and how it's changed through history, and some of the relevances also to case study and lawsuits. So we have another PowerPoint slide to share now.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Ah, there.
So now we have here a pair of earrings. There are a couple of stories in your book related to that in terms of sexuality and gender norms.
Yes. In the Renaissance in northern Italy, in certain northern Italian cities, Jewish women were required by law to wear earrings. There's a striking account that I write about in the book of a woman named Allegra who was arrested for not wearing her earrings. Now, the history behind this is at this same period of time, the use of jewelry and what by Christian women was condemned by the church. It was understood to be a vanity, the type of vanities that got thrown onto bonfires, for instance. So women, jewelry and adornments were considered to be signs of sin, of not only the sin of vanity, but also of sexual promiscuity. But at the same time, Jewish women are required to wear earrings in order to mark them, in order to ensure that everyone can tell the difference between Jew and Gentile. So there's not only that that simple significance of marking Jewish women as Jewish, but also tying them to the symbolism of sin and vanity that's denied, that that's rejected by the church.
Next slide.
So high-heeled shoes. Those I see red there. Now, high-heeled shoes, interestingly enough, began as a masculine fashion. They were brought introduced to Europe by Persian equestrians, and the high heel was designed to lock into a stirrup. And because these Persian equestrians were martial, they were macho, they were exotic, they were compelling, a lot of people wanted to look like them. And so it became a masculine fashion statement to wear high heels. It also became a sign of status. And over time, the heels got larger and larger. So when you get to the era of Louis XIV, for instance, there's a portrait of him that I have in the book, of very high heels painted red. And Louis XIV then eventually decreed, because this got so popular and so many people wanted to wear them, they decreed that only members of his royal court could wear high-heeled shoes with red. So a masculine fashion, and in the pattern that I suggested before, some fashion-forward women started to adopt this masculine fashion. This was what edgy avant-garde women would do. They'd adopt some aspect of male fashion. And only over a long period of time did the high-heeled shoe become a distinctively feminine article of clothing. This was part of what I described before as the great masculine renunciation. It's only at that period of time when showy and ostentatious fashions go out of favor for men, and a new ideal of masculine aristocratic virtue emerges, that men begin to reject the high-heeled shoe and mock and ridicule men who continue to wear them. There's some interesting examples of treatises or statements about, at one point, the English writer Alexander Pope wants to have any man wearing heels over 3 inches thrown out of his club. It says, "Go from among us and be tall if you can." So at that period of time, things flip, and it becomes a feminine accoutrement, which of course it is to this day. And the red heel has morphed into the red sole of, for instance, the Christian Louboutin brand.
And in terms of women wearing high heels, how about the height of the heel and how high the heel should be?
Well, there's a lot of regulation and a lot of judgment around high-heeled shoes. On the one hand, and this is a theme that runs throughout the history of women's fashion, is women have to walk this kind of tightrope between, on the one hand, the need to be decorative, the expectation that femininity involves a certain kind of decorativeness that men, masculine fashion doesn't, but also not to be too sexy. Not to be too alluring, and that to be modest. And the high-heeled shoe captures this. So there are a lot of dress codes that require women to wear high-heeled shoes, from workplaces, and there have been not only litigation, but protest movements against these types of things. Professional workplaces, Las Vegas cocktail lounges, women on the red carpet in Cannes required to wear high heels as that obligatory sign of femininity. But at the same time, when the heels get too high, there's judgment. So for instance, in one example I write about in the book, a woman's wearing some fairly high heels, and she's attending a conference, about a high-tech conference. And one of the CEOs of a tech company, a male CEO, takes a picture of her feet and posts it on Instagram and says, "These shoes, WTF, hashtag brains not required." And this is part of a long history of kind of mocking and ridiculing women for wearing high heels. At one point, before women gained the franchise in the United States, the New York Times ran an op-ed against high-heeled shoes, and it said, "Women's suffrage, the right to vote. First, show me a woman who can wear a sensible pair of shoes that doesn't hurt her feet as she walks down Fifth Avenue. Then we'll talk about equal rights." So the use of these kind of shoes was both required, but also used as evidence that women were unfit for equal social or equal civic life.
So we touched a little bit about this in the civil rights movement, but the alternatives of, workwear versus formal wear.
Yes, and so you see the Sunday best, the necktie, as a way of asserting dignity in a society that had often denied those symbols of dignity to African Americans. And this was an important statement. At the same time, just a few years later, a new generation thought that the appropriate symbolism was to dress in solidarity with the people that they were organizing. So you had a younger generation of civil rights activists wearing overalls because they were organizing sharecroppers. And I would argue that these two ideas about how political idealism should be expressed continue with us today. That there's a sense in which being well dressed in today's activist circles sometimes is sneered at and seen as an attempt to sort of suck up to the power structure. But at the same time, dressing down in supposed solidarity with the proletariat, with the working class, can be kind of condescending. And so each of these approaches or strategies has its strengths and its weaknesses. It's got its proponents and its detractors.
So next, makeup. So this kind of goes into the case studies and lawsuits based on dress codes for employments.
Yes. Yes, many cases involving makeup. And the history of makeup it's interesting because it wasn't until the early 20th century and actually the flappers that wearing a lot of makeup was a common thing for women. The makeup, of course, has a very, very long history, but for a long period of time, it was condemned as too sensual, as too vain, and as the domain of the disreputable women, theater performers and the like, not the gentlewoman. But after the flapper era, makeup becomes much more prevalent. It becomes easier to put on, for one thing. So the innovation of things like tubes of lipsticks and small jars of makeup instead of large kits makes it much more easy for women to wear makeup. And as the women's clothing becomes more streamlined, in a sense, almost in compensation, the makeup becomes more pronounced. So the makeup of the flapper is very dramatic. In today's environment, there are a lot of dress codes that require women to wear makeup. I write, for instance, about one case that involving a woman named Darlene Jesperson, who worked as a bartender at a casino for many years, never wore makeup, and did, by all accounts, a good job. But a new management team decided that all of the employees ought to look their personal best. That's what it was described. And they had a makeup and consultant come in and make everyone over, and then said, okay, now you need to come to work looking like that every day. Teased hair, full makeup. She didn't feel comfortable doing that. She thought it made her look ridiculous. It didn't fit with her self-image. She didn't want to do it. She thought it was sex discrimination because, of course, only women had to wear makeup, and she sued for sex discrimination. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty clearly discriminatory just on its face. Only women have to wear the makeup, not men. Should be an easy case. Turned out it was an easy case, but in the other direction. The courts decided, and they had decided since the early 1970s, that gender-specific dress codes don't violate the law against sex discrimination, provided they're in keeping with conventional social customs, provided they're not demeaning, and provided they don't impose unequal burdens. And the court thought none of those things applied to this dress code, so she lost her discrimination case. And that remains the law today, although you continue to have women pushing back against these kinds of gendered dress codes.
We don't have a slide for it, but you mentioned hairstyles. Can you talk about discrimination and appointment rules related to that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So there's also been a series of workplace dress codes that prohibit or that regulate hairstyles. And among those prohibitions include prohibitions on hairstyles typically worn by African Americans, and in particular African American women, all braided hairstyles, locks. These dress codes have historically been upheld by the courts as not discriminatory. The rationale is simply that no one can wear the all braided hairstyle. No one can wear their hair in locks, and therefore there's no race discrimination as a formal legal matter. African-American women have been pushing it back against these kind of dress codes for years, and they're finally starting to make some headway in the form of new regulations or new legislation, excuse me. So there's something called the Crown Act, which is now law in California. Something similar has been picked up in New York City, some other states, and it's now before the floor of Congress that would prohibit dress codes that ban these types of hairstyles. When you look at the history of racial justice struggles, and in particular that moment in the Black is Beautiful struggle, where people began to recognize the psychological and really status-based costs of standards of beauty and grooming that were geared toward Caucasian phenotype, you can begin to see why it is that people see this as a civil rights issue. And so, we're now moving into a period where perhaps those kinds of dress codes are being rethought.
Thank you. And our last slide, I don't see it on the screen anymore, but it's a pair of pants. So you mentioned Amanda Bloomer, but also I know there are other examples in history.
Yes. So until the early 20th century, and even after that, women wearing pants was considered to be quite scandalous. You remember that tailoring started to create fitted garments for men as early as the 1300s, but women, even if they adopted aspects of male tailoring, never below the waist. So a woman in pants or trousers or tights was considered to be quite scandalous. This was true all the way into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, a woman wearing pants was described as a bifurcated woman. And it was a sexual fetish. I've got a few examples in the book, but a magazine cover that talks about bifurcated girls. Now, these are just women wearing conventional men's pants. They're not tight, they're not see-through. There's nothing particularly sexy about them, but at that period of time, a woman in trousers was considered to be quite scandalous. And laws were on the books in many cities that would prohibit such attire on women as indecent.
And our last one that I don't have a slide for, but it's prompted by one of the questions, is the T-shirt.
Okay. How about gray T-shirts? So in today's environment, we tend to say that we're beyond all this worry about dress. People are relaxed. I'm here in the Silicon Valley, and the typical ethos is, we don't care about superficial stuff like fashion. In fact, the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, once said, I wear gray T-shirts every day. And the reason I wear the same gray T-shirt is because I don't want to waste my time and energy on frivolous things that don't matter, like what I'm wearing. And if I wasted any of my time worrying about what I was going to wear, I wouldn't be doing my job to make Facebook the best company it can be. Now, in a sense, that's not saying that you don't care about fashion. It's saying that you do care about it. And it is evidence of that. When people look too fashionable in the Silicon Valley, they're ridiculed. Another tech CEO, Marissa Mayer, likes fashion, wore a fashionable dress on the cover of a magazine. And the reaction in the Silicon Valley was, what is she doing? She looks like she's going out to a party or on vacation while everyone else is working. So clothing has now taken on this kind of moral significance, the dressed down aesthetic, which is maybe the logical extension of the great masculine renunciation. It's not really that people don't care about clothing, but instead they care about it in a different way. And that kind of clothing reflects a particular kind of hard-nosed work ethic that's in a sense just as powerful a dress code as any dress code in the past.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and read some questions from the chat box.
Great.
The first is clothing considered a form of free speech, the way an armband was an issue in the Tinker case used to protest Vietnam?
Great question. Yes. Generally speaking, no. Clothing can be a form of free speech, and the armband case is a good example of it. It's usually, though, only a form of free speech when it has that kind of direct, almost manifesto-like significance. So everyone understands the black armband means opposition to the war in Vietnam. That's a statement. On the other hand, let's take an example, an African-American man wearing sagging jeans. Not as clear a statement. It certainly is signifying something, but not enough to raise First Amendment questions. And in fact, that's sagging pants have been banned in many cities in the United States. Now, the ACLU sometimes takes the position that this violates the First Amendment, but the courts in general haven't agreed.
And speaking of courts, the next question is, how do courts evaluate what is acceptable when there are books written about how to dress for success?
How do courts evaluate what's acceptable? And now, if we're talking about what's acceptable in the courtroom, it's very interesting that some judges have some very strict standards about what's acceptable in their courtroom. And, you know, as is often the case, this tends to focus more scrutiny on women. So female attorneys have been admonished in open court for wearing sleeveless dresses or dresses that are too short, or not wearing nylons, or wearing pants. There's one case I write about where a judge who's legally blind, you know, can't see anything in the courtroom, has a clerk tell him whether the women are wearing pants because he doesn't think that's acceptable attire in the courtroom. There are a lot of Dress for Success books for lawyers that focus on the variety of pitfalls that one can fall into in dressing. And again, this is focused more scrutiny on women, in part because women have more fewer strict rules. The man can always just put on a blue suit and they're done. You know, women have a little more flexibility, but also therefore more ways to run afoul of what some employer or some judge or the other thinks they should be wearing.
We talked about baggy pants. The next question is, what do you make of today's fashion of dressing down? Paying a fortune for jeans that are ripped and full of holes, and tops that you buy already looking rumpled.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting that, so there are a couple things about dressing down. I mean, one, there is this idea that dressing down shows that you're practical, that you're, you know, unassuming, that you're not status conscious. And I think there's a real ethos toward that. You know, that's a fashion statement of its own type in many instances. The torn clothing and things like that, you know, there is a legacy there of a kind of bohemian look that started in the 1960s with the hippies, or maybe even earlier than that, where that kind of you know, distressed or worn in look becomes popular. And again, I think it has some relationship to an ideal of authenticity, that what one's expressing with this kind of worn in clothing is that it looks like something that you've had for years. It looks like, in that sense, it looks like something that's more personal to you than the brand new squeaky clean, you know, sharply pressed garment. And I would suspect that that has a lot to do with the popularity of that trend.
And the next question is about knee breeches. How did they evolve into full-length loose trousers in about 1810?
Oh, there's a bit I write about in the book about the move from knee breeches to long trousers. And here's a little anecdote. In France during the Revolution, of course, the knee breeches were understood as a symbol of aristocratic dress, whereas the dress of the working person and the dress, therefore, of the revolutionaries were long pants. So sans culotte meant without knee breeches, and that was one of the symbols of the attire of the revolution. So there's political significance read into that. When Thomas Jefferson visited France, he got a very refined and very well-tailored version of the long pants that were becoming fashionable in France, brought them back to the United States, and that became a new type of fashion, also with the symbolism of a certain kind of egalitarian Republican sentiment. And shortly thereafter, it became so widespread as a fashion that the notion silk stocking, a silk stocking is someone who's hidebound and kind of overly status conscious, that crept into popular vocabulary as a result of this kind of change in fashion.
And going back to the formality and informality of clothing, how do you think COVID and telecommuting or people being home will affect fashion trends, short-term and long-term?
Yeah, it's interesting that during COVID now there's a lot more dressing down in some sense because it seems a little silly to put on a whole suit while you're going to be on Zoom and only no one can see you below the torso. And you've also and again, this ideal of authenticity I think works its way in that you want to seem not pretentious and so dressed down clothing is much more important when everyone knows you're in your living room and they can kind of see the dirty dishes behind you or what have you. But you're also getting this kind of high status dress down clothing, high status athleisure. I've seen a lot of articles in the press about this where people want to dress down, but they also want to show that they're professional. They also want to show that they have a particular kind of professional status. And so they're looking for something that distinguishes their dress down thing from what their kid is wearing, while they're playing a video game. And so you've got that. I think that'll continue. It's part of a trend that was already going before COVID. At the same time, I kind of suspect that a lot of people are ready to break out and dress up. And so I imagine you're going to see a lot more very expressive fashion, maybe only after hours, maybe only for recreational purposes, but you're going to see more dressing up as well as people finally get to break out of their COVID-based quarantines.
And do you think it's more or less difficult these days to navigate social and dress norms?
In many ways, I think it's harder. And part of the reason I think it's harder is because many of the norms are so much more subtle. You get rid of the dress code, the formal dress code that says you need to wear a suit and a tie or what have you. And then here's an example, the investment bank, Goldman Sachs, recently got rid of its dress code. And, but they added this. We all know what is and is not appropriate for the workplace. Now you need to figure out what is and is not appropriate, and you're not going to be told, but you'll be judged. And what you see in one instance is a kind of panicked gravitation toward a new dress code. There's an Instagram page called Midtown Uniform, and this is a bunch of investment bankers who used to have a suit and tie dress code, and they don't anymore. And do they all wear some shirt, a Patagonia fleece, a pair of khaki pants, a pair of loafers? Hundreds of them, all wearing exactly the same thing. There's no dress code, but there's a de facto dress code that you need to know, and it's got to be the right kind of fleece. There are only 2 or 3 brands that seem to be acceptable. Patagonia seems to be the most preferred. Can't be a hoodie. What do women do? Not clear. Women used to be able to wear, a woman's pantsuit. Now that's seen as too uptight, too stuffy. You can't wear that. Also can't wear the Midtown Uniform. That's pretty masculine. So I think in many ways, these dress codes are harder to navigate. Same thing with the Silicon Valley. They say it doesn't matter, but watch out. If you look too fashionable, people are going to think that you're silly and frivolous and not doing your job.
Are there types of clothing that have been associated with specific professions, like judicial robes, cowboy boots, bakery aprons? As society becomes more virtual, is clothing less relevant?
Oh, it becomes more virtual. There's certainly types of clothing that are associated with particular professions. The judicial wig in England is one example of something that started as, a more commonly worn aristocratic fashion, certainly, and then became even more commonly worn even by non-aristocrats. But as it went out of fashion, it stuck with the legal profession. And at one point, because it was custom but never required for lawyers to wear the bench wig, which is now a legal requirement for arguing in front of a court in England. There was one case where the judge, a lawyer came in without the wig on, and the judge said that the lawyer was not seen. And that meant you're not appropriately dressed, and I won't listen to you until you go back and dress appropriately. And that was the case that established the rule now that English barristers have to wear the bench wig. So you get these kind of interesting evolutions where something evolves into a particular type of professional dress. Does it matter less because we're virtual? Well, in some sense, yes. Now, what's interesting is, people now spend, in many cases, more time curating the things that you can see on Zoom, like the background. So if you're on Zoom a lot, you might wind up on a site called Room Rater. And Room Rater looks at your background and gives it a rating according to what, are the dirty dishes piled up, or, what kind of artwork is in the background, or what, what's on your bookshelf. And so you'll notice if you start to look at a lot of these videos that people spend some time arranging the bookshelf and getting the right book behind them. And, if you've got a book that you've just published, like I do, you're smart to have it in the background so people can see it. So in one sense, that's a new kind of dress code, but it's a dress code for our whole house.
Next question is, what impact do you see in the behaviors of people who wear uniforms, like military, police, nurses?
Oh, it's interesting. I had an interesting conversation with someone in the military about this question, because in one there was a time when military uniforms were tailor-made in the sense that you went to a tailor and they would make the uniform for you. This is, in English history, for instance, and you get the evolution of a lot of menswear from the relationship between Savile Row tailoring and military uniforms and then civilian clothing. Of course, in the US military, the uniform is, uniform. It's not something where you design any of the details yourself. But this military officer pointed out to me that although it's true that there's a code and there's a standard issue uniform, a lot of officers go to a tailor and have it personalized, and they have little details changed, and they have it customized. There's a whole culture of this, and it's a bunch of tailors around Annapolis and indeed all over the world where military officers are stationed that do this type of work. So, a little bit of individual personality and a little bit of individual, pride of presentation worked in even to something that seems to be as regimented as a military uniform.
I think there are two pieces of that. One is how someone feels. Someone mentioned that when they're more formally dressed, they're more mindful of their demeanor and speech. Yeah. And I think the second piece is how you're perceived. In your book, there is an experiment with a lab coat.
Yes.
You want to talk about that?
Yes. So if someone's required, the experiment involved asking people to put on a lab coat and then do some kind of scientific quiz. And one group, they said, this is a scientific lab coat. Put that on and now do the quiz. And then the control group, they said, this is a painter's coat. Just put it on and do the same quiz. And they found that the people who were told that it was a lab coat had higher scores on the test. Controlling for all the things that you would expect would make the scores vary, had higher scores than the people who were told it was a painter's coat. And that does suggest that the psychological importance of the symbolism of clothing is very important. I'd also argue that there's an importance in the way clothing feels on the body, the way it either is loose and baggy or tighter and more form-fitting, constricting in a variety of ways, that these things matter too. And it's not a simple matter of comfortable or uncomfortable, but different types of comfort and different types of constraint that matter a lot to people in terms of the way they carry themselves and the way they see themselves.
And there's a question about the difference in dress codes in different countries. Have you explored recent differences in politics, social movements?
A little bit. Most of the history in the book is limited to Europe, and that was, enough to make an almost 500-page book. So other cultures will let you have to wait. And it's a huge cultural undertaking. I do talk a little bit about post-colonial movements or anti-colonial movements and their relationship to clothing. So in a variety of colonial encounters, there's a tense relationship around Western dress. On the one hand, Western dress is understood to be modern. And so political leaders adopt Western dress to demonstrate their modernity and to kind of move their nations into what they consider to be the modern world, as so that they can compete with and stand up to European powers. But of course, at the same time, adopting Western dress can seem like a capitulation to Western power. And so there are other examples in which a colonial leader might actually ban Western dress and in order to create a kind of authentic national costume. Usually those projects don't turn out very well, and a more organic relationship with fashion is what tends to be successful. But I do write a bit about that in the book.
I definitely enjoyed reading this book. I know it's been very well received, and it sounds like you had a lot of fun doing the research.
Absolutely.
Do you have any plans to follow up with another book or in a different format, like a podcast?
I'm doing a little work right now on some blogging on a site called Medium, and I'm sure I will follow up with another book at some point. The research runway is pretty long to do a book like this, so I probably spent 4 or 5 years on research and writing this book. So it may be a little while till the next one comes out. But I did have a great time writing it. I'm very interested in continuing to explore aspects of this. I mean, there's a lot that wound up on the proverbial cutting room floor that I think is interesting and that I might want to introduce in a different context.
So it wasn't just a COVID project?
No, absolutely not. Well before COVID.
Yeah, I imagine so. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. And to anybody who has not read the book yet, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks.